There's a new leader in charge at NATO. Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, has taken over from Jen Stoltenberg, who stepped down after 10 years in the job. It comes at a time of huge instability, and he's facing a tough task ahead. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Mark Rutte has been setting out his priorities for NATO after taking on its leadership. They include bolstering support for Ukraine, increasing defence spending and maintaining global partnerships. But what are the challenges he's facing and how is he planning to tackle them?
With the passing of an historic Viking gable, the Transatlantic Alliance welcomed its new leader. After a record 10 years as head of NATO, Jen Stoltenberg handed power over to Mark Rutte, someone he thought was the right person for the job.
I think Mark Rutte is a very strong candidate. He has a lot of experience as Prime Minister. He's a close friend and colleague.
Amidst the war in Ukraine, China's rising power, and an upcoming US election, the former Dutch Prime Minister steps into his new role at a challenging time. So what should we expect in terms of NATO's priorities under this new leadership? Mark Rutte has already pledged NATO's continued assistance to Kiev.
Supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do. And it is also an investment in our own security. Because an independent and democratic Ukraine is vital for peace and stability in Europe. And the cost of supporting Ukraine is far, far lower than the cost we would face if we allow Putin to get his way.
He has emphasized NATO's commitment to defense spending, but considering his own country's poor record in this area, he may find it hard to convince the other allies. Regarding the upcoming US elections, Rutte said he can work with both leaders.
Of course, Kamala Harris has a fantastic record as Vice President. She's a highly respected leader, so I will be able to work with both, whatever is the outcome of the elections. And of course, I cannot vote, so we'll see what happens.
As global security threats and challenges seem to continue, can new leader Rutte ensure that NATO remains resilient?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining me from Nottingham in the UK is Colin Alexander. He's a senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham Trent University. In Brussels, we have Shea. He is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. And here with me in the studio is Marko Gasic. He's an international affairs analyst. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Jamie, I'll come to you first. With your knowledge of NATO, I've heard it said that the job of Secretary General is much less general and a lot more secretary. What's your reading of it and how does Rutte fit in?
Well, I think there's some truth in that description, even though it sounds a little unkind. I mean, he is not the sort of person who can make NATO policy. He has to represent the policy which the 32 allies have agreed, and he has to drive the NATO bureaucracy, which is rather large, both military and civilian, to deliver on the things that the NATO heads of state and government, meeting most recently at NATO's 75th anniversary summit in Washington, have decided. But although, if you like, he's more secretary than general, he still has a lot of influence. He's able to set the agenda, the weekly meetings of the North Atlantic Council, and the allies really do rely upon him to be the super diplomat who sort of keeps the family together. And as we saw from his predecessor, Jen Stoltenberg, this is not always easy. You've got Trump potentially coming back with his views on NATO. You've got people like Viktor Orban in Hungary who doesn't always play along. So although I'm sure the Secretary General would like to spend a lot of his time traveling outside NATO, forming new partnerships, traveling inside NATO to keep the family together, to keep NATO united is an increasingly important part of the portfolio.
Colin, just on that phrase, super diplomat, I mean, Rutte has huge experience of building coalitions in the Netherlands. He's going to need all of that political diplomacy to make this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's I mean, I should say that there's a degree of opaqueness about how NATO certainly appoints somebody to this role, and perhaps Jamie's more in a position to explain to us the ins and outs of that. But Rutte has built a commanding presence of being able to make deals and being able to negotiate and being able to bring people of divided camps together in order to find practical ways forward. And that's why he is, I would say, that's the main attractiveness of the Rutte appointment. He's also been around the top of politics in Europe and the world for well over a decade, so he's very well known to all of the leaders within the NATO countries, and he's also pretty well known to Putin as well, which hopefully will count, will have some degree of currency within this process.
Marko, come to you on this. He's a safe pair of hands, isn't he? That's why he got the job.
He's a safe pair of hands for those who want the job to be about effectively what they used to call a neocon direction. In other words, he's there to make sure that people get in line behind the policy of being extremely beastly to Russia and damn the consequences, or rather risk the consequences. So yes, he'll be safe in that camp, but in the camp of those dissident members of what Jamie Shea calls the family, who aren't so keen on the war, are more keen on a peace process to start as early as possible with a negotiated end rather than uncertain military finish, he's not quite the flavour of the month. So countries like Turkey, Slovakia, Premier Fico, Hungary, of course, as well, they're less keen on the direction that he will represent and try to force them into.
And tell me, in terms of priorities, Ukraine is obviously top of the list.
Yes, it is. And there again, he's advocating that the Storm Shadow missiles be used heading anywhere they like in Russia, permission be given and granted for this to happen, which will be something which Russia will perceive as a British move, since it's a British missile, British guided. And it's going to be a very, very risky step if anyone was so silly as to take it. So one hopes that he will come to his senses.
Jamie, your reading of the priority list, obviously Ukraine is number one in the in-tray.
Well, absolutely, because at that summit in Washington that I mentioned just before Rutte took over from Stoltenberg, the Allies decided to really put NATO much more front and centre in the international effort to help Ukraine. Headquarters in Ramstein and Wiesbaden being set up to act as the day-to-day sort of coordinators and facilitators of the aid, matching what Ukraine needs to available supplies, speeding up the training, reducing the 140 different types of weapon systems that Ukraine certainly has. So he's under pressure to sort of demonstrate that putting NATO more front and center is really going to make a difference when it comes to getting Ukraine those air defense systems and other things that it most urgently needs. But of course, there's also the long-term aspect, because NATO has promised Ukraine membership one day. That promise goes back to 2008. And the peace plan that President Zelensky has recently put on the table includes the obligation of that NATO membership. But the Allies still don't quite know when it's going to be possible, under which circumstances. And therefore, what Rutte has to do is look after the short-term assistance to Ukraine while the war is going on, but also get the Allies behind a concept of building a bridge to the Ukraine of the future, the Ukrainian army of the future, interoperability with NATO, and how to transition to some kind of concept of how and when Ukraine could eventually join the alliance. So Ukraine certainly is going to be, I think, probably his most immediate concern. And therefore, it's not surprising that virtually 24 hours after taking over at NATO headquarters last week, he made his first foreign trip, guess where, to Kiev.
Colin, he takes over at a huge moment for NATO and a huge moment for Europe as well, as we're heading into a third winter of this war. I mean, the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine, how do you think he can dance delicately around that?
Well, I don't know if there's any ability to dance delicately around it. I think that on the one hand, I'll try and do both sides of the coin here. On the one hand, that I understand Ukraine's preoccupation with becoming a NATO member. However, I think that ultimately becoming a NATO member ultimately assigns Ukraine and the east of Ukraine to perhaps being a battlefield for a lot longer, because the accusation that Russia labels at NATO towards its eastern expansion isn't some sort of flippant comment. It isn't propaganda. It is a valid concern that they have. Equally, though, the question for Putin and for Russia is how do we deal with that concern? And launching an invasion of Ukraine a couple of years ago was just one option on the table for them. So at the same time, Russia still has blood on its hands, if you like.
Marko, just tell me, how big of a red line is Ukrainian membership of NATO for the Russians, do you think?
What the Russians are perfectly aware of is that Ukraine membership for NATO membership for Ukraine means NATO weapons, NATO troops in Ukraine, as it means the same everywhere else. So basically, what it's saying is, if Ukraine joins NATO, NATO gets a chance to get its weapons and its missiles up close and personal to Russia, 5 minutes from Moscow, and then they'll have a little negotiation session with Russia. That's the plan. Russia is not going to allow that. If the mugger comes with a knife to your throat, you're not going to stick around really to have that. You will take action. The Russians will take action. They're already taking action. We're in this mess because NATO decided to move forward and keep moving forward towards its target, which is what NATO does. This is my problem with the NATO pact. It's there to achieve a military aim. It's there for a conquest of its opponent. Its opponent gets demonized, satanized, and slowly then legitimized as a target of NATO attack. So NATO is the threat to world peace because it does not want to share that world with the rest of the world. It would rather risk destroying the world instead of sharing it. That's my problem with NATO, and that's NATO's problem for the rest of the world.
So how do you think the Kremlin will view this appointment of Rutte?
More of the same, because the Western mindset is never, many parts of the West have no experience of defeat in war. They believe that problems in war are just temporary things. You just have to keep going and keep going harder. The US is a case in point, and Britain too. And this is what they're doing. But you're dealing with Russia, with an opponent which has insuperable resources and which really will one day take them to you, and you will be in trouble. So what NATO is doing is risking its own population, risking its own survival, its own country's survival, as well as the survival of its opponents. This is a mad policy. I prefer an agreement to be reached between them, referenda in the various locations where they vote for Ukraine membership. That area agrees to be demilitarized forever and neutral forever, so that it's a threat to nobody, and where they vote to join Russia, perhaps an arrangement whereby the resources of that region be shared by both Ukrainians and Russians, because if the Russians believe that they're brother peoples, sure, share the resources, but let the people stay in the country of their choice. And finally, we should remember that the people in the east of Ukraine were rubbing along perfectly happily as part of Ukraine until the forcible overthrow of the democratically elected government, because it expressed its freedom of choice not to actually join on to this association agreement with its military component and to accept subsidies from Russia instead. That, for me, is a perfectly sensible choice because it meant money instead of military. That's what they chose. That's why the government was overthrown. That's why we're here now, 10 years later.
Jamie, just a few short weeks now, and there will be an election in the United States to bring in a new president. If it is Donald Trump 2.0, how do you think NATO under Rutte will work with Donald J. Trump?
Well, Mark Rutte was Prime Minister of the Netherlands during the previous, if Trump is re-elected, we'll speak of his previous 4 years in the White House, and he has a lot of experience of handling Trump. And I think that's obviously one of the attractive things about him when it came to choosing him to be the successor to Jen Stoltenberg. There's a sense that if anybody can sort of communicate with Trump and get the message over, it's probably among the existing pool of European Prime Ministers, Rutte. On the other hand, of course, the first first Trump presidency was somewhat ambivalent. Yes, there was a lot of criticism of NATO, particularly defense spending. But on the other hand, the United States went on building infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe, supplying, even under Trump, lethal weapons for the first time to Ukraine. And US forces came over on NATO exercises. It was very much business as usual. Trump did not carry out threats to withdraw US forces from Germany. And at the end, he sort of began to realize that the way in which he used shock therapy to get the European allies to spend more on defense and meet the NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP on defense was having an impact. Now, today, if Rutte has to go and deal with Trump in Washington, he's probably got better arguments to defend NATO than Stoltenberg did at the beginning, because 23 allies are now spending that 2% of GDP on defense. We see Europeans modernizing their military forces. Europeans are doing more than the United States across the board to assist Ukraine. If you factor in, budget humanitarian assistance, training of Ukrainian forces and the like, it's Europeans who are supplying F-16 aircraft, not the United States. So we have to wait and see. I mean, it's unpredictable. The answer is we don't know. It depends on two other factors. Who does Trump appoint in his key positions? State Department, Defense Department, National Security Council. Will they be sort of pro-NATO internationalists, as many Republicans still are? And secondly, and finally, Enda, the composition of the US Congress, because obviously what helped NATO during the first Trump presidency is that there were many Republicans in Congress who were pro-Ukraine and pro-NATO, and who sort of tried to do their utmost to stop Trump doing anything too unilateral. For example, like withdrawing from the NATO treaty. But again, after the elections, will these people be back in Congress? Will they be voted out? We simply don't know. But the experience of Trump, number one, is that he's open to persuasion. He changes his mind an awful lot, and the actions don't always follow the rhetoric.
Colin, I noticed a quote from Rutte saying, with regard to whoever wins the White House, he has told allies and colleagues that you have to work with whoever is on the dance floor. Do you think he'd prefer to be dancing with Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think for the purposes of consistency, probably yes. But I think Jamie's right here that Trump is reliably unreliable, and he hasn't followed through with a lot of the talk from his first presidency. So I don't necessarily think that whoever wins the race to the White House it impacts things all that much. I think, going back to the previous point, which Jamie and Marko have made, NATO is ultimately a military alliance, and the primacy here is within, or the professional bias here is within, military-based decision-making, and what Marko was saying about NATO's expansion, defeat of opponent, etc. And so a lot of the politicians, they often play second fiddle to the military interest within all this. So really, who wins the White House? How much does that actually change US foreign policy, or how much does a president actually have the ability to change US foreign policy? In the same way that most countries' foreign policies are pretty consistent, no matter who wins elections and various turnovers of power. So I think the NATO worldview remains the same regardless. And I probably agree a little bit with both of my discussants that NATO is partly the problem here, but also that sense of lack of sharing and the competition for resources is probably the underlying problem that we have here. We've got we have a problem with natural resources and competition for them, which drives people into conflict.
And Marko, Trump has been very blunt about spending levels and countries not pulling their weight in NATO and spending 2% of GDP on defence. I mean, we know what's coming, don't we, if he does get back into power with regard to NATO?
Well, there'll be more of the same. There's another 8 countries still to go, and he'll be reminding them all of their obligations. But I think that, to go back to the previous point, it is the conversation that Trump will have will be less with Mark Rutte and more with those component parts of the American deep state that actually benefit from ongoing military activity, the military-industrial complex, the corporations that sell the weapons, the corporations that reconstruct the destroyed Ukraine, the corporations that will be charged for by the Americans in their help when they give it, so that the Ukrainians will have to give their assets, their resources, as Colin mentioned, those incredible agricultural resources which are, as we speak, already being privatized and piratized away already. So the key conversation is, can Trump actually change any of that reality? I mean, the American establishment is so strong as to really make him, he's an individual at the top, but he's just an individual. Again, as I think Mr. Shea said, it depends on who he appoints for it to be his team. If he has a team which thinks the way he does, he may get a negotiated end to this war pretty quickly. If he gets a different team, he'll be shackled, stopped, satanized again, like another 4 years of anti-Trumpism that present him in all kinds of colors, even though he was the one American president that didn't have a war on his watch, so for which I heartily approve. So these are the kind of background issues which will define the nature of the Trump presidency.
Jamie, the spending issue is obviously a very important discussion point, isn't it, for the new Secretary General?
Well, yes, it is, because as was mentioned, there are still many allies who are not yet or close to that 2% benchmark, and Mr. Trump will certainly want all 32 allies to be there. So Mark Rutte will certainly have some proselytizing work to do, at least trying to convince those countries to meet the benchmark. But there's also voices in Europe and in the United States saying that the level of defense spending should be even higher. For example, around 3% of GDP. Poland is this year over 4% of GDP. The Baltic states are up towards 3%. So there is a sort of discrepancy between efforts in Central and Eastern Europe, where obviously worry over Russia is at its height, and elsewhere in the alliance. So that's something that Rutte is going to have to manage carefully, particularly with the next NATO summit in the Netherlands next year. But Enda, I think more importantly than even all of that is the question of translating that money into effective capability. Anybody who knows defense knows that this is an area where it's easy to waste a lot of money, producing very little at the end of the day. And translating those funds into contracts for defense industry, restocking ammunition and spare parts in Europe, improving air defense, raising the 50 new NATO brigades that the NATO military commanders would like to see. All of that's going to be quite a challenge, reducing duplication, making the most of civilian technologies. This is really going to be where the rubber hits the road. So I think it's good for Rutte on the one hand to go around making the case for more defense spending, but NATO is going to have to demonstrate that collectively it has a good strategy for producing cost effectively better military capability from that expenditure. If there's a sense among public that billions of these extra euros and dollars have been wasted over white elephant programs that don't really enhance NATO's collective defense, the ability of leaders like Rutte to generate public support, political support for extra defense spending is going to be a lot more difficult.
Colin, how does Rutte go about cracking the whip in terms of the countries who are not reaching 2% of GDP on defence spend?
I'm going to answer this a little bit differently. I think that the existence, I think the problem here is that we talk about weapons of war and of mass destruction and various things as though they're kind of cheese sandwiches and cups of coffee. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is humanitarian catastrophe and ecological catastrophe, which happens as a result of warfare. So ultimately, if our goal is to have a more peaceful world, a fairer, more just, healthier world, then increasing your GDP by an extra 0.5% or whatever it may be doesn't do anything towards that. We should be working towards de-escalation and the reduction of that. And this is the key problem with NATO, in that because NATO is a military alliance, it perceives to solve a problem through military means, and that means increases in spending. And what we really should be advocating for as publics around the world is saying, not in our name, that what we want is a de-escalation of this and less xenophobia, etc. That's the key message here. And I think that when I see somebody like Rutte or anybody else advocating for increases in military spending, it really kind of beguiles me and leads to a real sense of kind of depression that we are escalating ourselves into a world where very few people can live in safety and harmony.
Final point to you, Marko, on that. I'm guessing the Russians would be very happy if that's what happens.
If what happens?
If people spend less on defence.
Well, yes, they will, and the Chinese and most Americans and most British would probably like that. People in hospitals, old age pensioners, students, those who've lost who are paying expensive energy. There'll be a lot of people all over the planet, including those Russian people as well, amazingly, who'll be quite happy if less is spent on defence. Also, because they will then need to spend less on defence as well. There will be less of an arms race, less money for those who make the arms. I'm very sorry for the military-industrial complex and its poverty, but for the rest of us, I think it will be quite a reasonable alternative.
Marko, Colin and Jamie, that's all we have time for. Thanks for your insight on this. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.